The stench of blood and sweat hung thick in the private arena beneath the imperial palace. It was the smell of death, of conquest, of a god walking among mortals. Emperor Lucius Aurelius Commodus stood in the center of the sand, his muscular frame glistening with oil and perspiration, a club gripped in his right hand. Around him lay the bodies of crippled animals and terrified men. Some senators, some slaves, all chosen for his pleasure. This was Rome in 192 A.D., and the most powerful man in the world believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules. But the gods were watching, and they were preparing his doom. Commodus hadn't always been mad. Born on August 31st, 161 A.D., he entered the world as twin sons to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king whose meditations on Stoicism would echo through millennia. Yet fate was cruel from the beginning. His twin brother died within weeks, leaving Commodus as the sole heir to the greatest empire the world had ever known. From that moment, he was marked, blessed by fortune, cursed by destiny. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was everything Rome idealized: wise, measured, just, the emperor who wrote about virtue while defending the empire's borders against barbarian hordes. He wanted his son to embody these same qualities, to become a philosopher warrior who would guide Rome into a golden age. But Commodus was not his father. Where Marcus Aurelius found joy in books and contemplation, young Commodus craved the roar of crowds, the clash of steel, the primal thrill of combat. The boy's tutors tried desperately to mold him into a scholar. They filled his days with Greek philosophy, rhetoric, and mathematics. But Commodus would sneak away to watch the gladiators train, his eyes blazing with fascination as men fought and died for entertainment. He didn't want to read about heroes. He wanted to become one, and not just any hero. He became obsessed with Hercules, the demigod who accomplished 12 impossible labors, who strangled serpents as an infant, who ascended to Olympus itself. When Commodus was just 5 years old, there was an assassination attempt. Poison was discovered in his food, placed there by conspirators who feared what he might become. The poison was detected. The conspirators executed in ways that made even hardened Romans turn away. But the damage was done. The young prince learned that the world was full of enemies, that trust was a weapon others would use against him, that only strength, brutal, undeniable strength, could keep him safe. His father made him co-emperor at age 16, hoping responsibility would mature him. Instead, it fed his ego. Commodus accompanied Marcus Aurelius to the Danubian frontier, where Rome was locked in grinding warfare against Germanic tribes. But while his father strategized and suffered alongside his soldiers, Commodus grew bored with military discipline. He wanted glory without the tedious work of earning it. He wanted to be worshipped, not merely respected. Then, in 180 A.D., Marcus Aurelius died. Some whispered it was natural causes, the plague that had ravaged Rome, the exhaustion of constant warfare. Others murmured darker theories, suggesting that Commodus had grown impatient for his inheritance. Whatever the truth, the philosopher emperor was gone, and the gladiator emperor took his place. Rome held its breath. At first, Commodus seemed manageable. He quickly ended the Germanic wars, not through victory, but through generous peace terms that allowed him to return to Rome in triumph. The Senate was relieved. The people cheered. He was young, handsome, charismatic. Perhaps he would be different from the tyrant of old. Perhaps Marcus Aurelius had taught him well. They were catastrophically wrong. Commodus discovered that being emperor was boring. The endless meetings with the Senate, the tedious management of provinces, the complex diplomacy required to maintain an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. It was all so dreadfully dull. He wanted excitement. He wanted to fight, to kill, to prove himself the mightiest warrior Rome had ever seen. So he delegated everything. He appointed a series of favorites to actually run the empire while he pursued his true passion, becoming Hercules. His chamberlain, Cleander, essentially ruled Rome while Commodus spent his days in the gladiatorial schools. Training obsessively, he would rise before dawn to practice with the sword, the trident, the net. He studied the techniques of famous gladiators, memorizing their moves, perfecting their strategies. But there was a problem. Real gladiators risked death. They fought with genuine desperation, knowing that each bout might be their last. Commodus wanted the glory of the arena, without the danger. So he rigged everything. He began fighting in the Colosseum, but his opponents were always given blunted weapons while his were razor sharp. Crippled men were brought before him, their feet bound, and he would club them to death while the crowd was forced to cheer. He fought animals, ostriches, elephants, tigers, but they were always weakened, drugged, or simply too young to pose real threat. He once killed 100 bears in a single day, shooting them with arrows from the safety of the arena's walkways. And he forced the people of Rome to watch. Attendance at performances was mandatory. Senators were required to sit in the front rows, close enough to be splattered with blood, and shout their approval. Those who showed insufficient enthusiasm were noted. Some disappeared. Others were bankrupted by sudden accusations of treason. Their property seized to fill the imperial coffers. The Senate seethed with hatred, but was powerless. Commodus surrounded himself with Praetorian guards who were paid triple the normal wages. He created a network of spies and informers who reported any whispered dissent. Rome had become a prison where the warden was insane, and the inmates wore togas. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The months were renamed after his various titles. September became Hercules. October became Invictus, the unconquerable. He commissioned hundreds of statues showing himself as Hercules, wearing the lion skin, carrying the club. In some, he strangled serpents. In others, he held the severed heads of his enemies. His appearance changed. He grew his hair long and wild, styled to match ancient depictions of Hercules. He wore a lion skin over his shoulders, even during official Senate meetings. His eyes, once clear and intelligent, took on a fever quality. He spoke of himself in the third person, referring to the Emperor Commodus or Hercules reborn, as if he were narrating his own legend. The people of Rome, who had once cheered him, now lived in terror. His paranoia grew like a cancer. Anyone could be accused of plotting against him. Wealthy senators found themselves on death lists for the crime of being too popular or too rich. Their executions were creative and public. Crucifixions, burnings, being torn apart by wild animals in the arena. But even as Commodus drowned Rome in blood, forces were gathering against him. In the shadows of the palace, a conspiracy was forming, and it included the people closest to him, the very ones he trusted to keep him safe. His final days were approaching, and they would be more horrifying than anything he had inflicted on others. The gods of Rome were preparing their justice, and it would be brutal. The year 192 AD began with omens. A comet blazed across the Roman sky for 7 nights, its tail like a bloody sword pointing directly at the imperial palace. In the Forum, a statue of Mars spontaneously cracked down the middle. Priests sacrificed bulls to read the entrails, and what they saw made their faces pale with dread. They whispered their findings only to each other, too terrified to speak openly. The gods were angry. Something terrible was coming. Commodus dismissed these warnings with contempt. He was Hercules. He was immortal. No force in heaven or earth could harm him. But in the dark corridors of the palace, 3 people were preparing to prove him catastrophically wrong. The first was Marcia, his mistress, and the woman closest to his heart. She was beautiful, intelligent, and utterly ruthless, qualities that helped her survive in Commodus's increasingly unstable court. For years, she had shared his bed, listened to his ravings about godhood, and smiled while he described his arena victories in excruciating detail. But Marcia was also a Christian, part of the persecuted faith that Commodus occasionally tormented for entertainment. She had watched him order Christians torn apart by lions, had seen him laugh as they burned. She had learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of adoration, but the mask was cracking. Commodus's paranoia had reached new heights. He trusted no one completely, not even Marcia. He had begun making lists, names of people to be executed, properties to be seized, senators to be humiliated. And one night, while Commodus lay in a drunken stupor, Marcia found a particular list that made her blood freeze. Her name was on it. The second conspirator was Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain. He was a man who managed the palace, who knew every secret passage, every guard rotation, every detail of the emperor's daily routine. Eclectus had served Marcus Aurelius faithfully, had watched the wise philosopher emperor rule with justice and mercy. Now he served the philosopher's son, and every day was an exercise in horror. He had been forced to arrange Commodus's grotesque arena spectacles, to procure crippled victims for the emperor to slaughter, to smile and applaud as Rome descended into madness. Eclectus had also seen the lists. His name wasn't on them yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. Commodus's paranoia was like a wildfire, consuming everyone eventually. The Chamberlain understood that he had two choices: strike first or die screaming. The third conspirator was the most dangerous of all, Quintus Aemilius Laetus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard. This man commanded the emperor's personal military force, the elite soldiers who were supposed to protect Commodus with their lives. Laetus was a career soldier, pragmatic and cold. He had watched Commodus transform Rome into a carnival of death, had seen the empire's administration crumble while the emperor played gladiator. Worse, Commodus had begun making noises about disbanding the Senate entirely and ruling solely through military force, a move that would destabilize everything. Laetus had also found his name on a list. Commodus, in his paranoid delusions, suspected even his own Praetorian prefect of plotting against him. The irony was exquisite. The emperor's paranoia was creating the very conspiracy he feared. The three met in secret, in a room deep beneath the palace where even Commodus's spies couldn't reach. The walls were thick stone, muffling sound. A single oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across their faces. They spoke in whispers, knowing that discovery meant torture and death. "He's planning something for the new year," Marcia said, her voice tight with urgency. "A spectacle unlike anything Rome has seen. He intends to appear in the Colosseum dressed as Hercules on January 1st, to inaugurate his consulship by personally killing gladiators and animals. But that's not all." She paused, her hands trembling. "He plans to move into the gladiator barracks permanently. He wants to live among them, to abandon the palace entirely." Eclectus shook his head in disbelief. The Emperor of Rome, living in the gladiator quarters like a common fighter? The Senate will revolt. The provinces will see it as weakness. The empire will fracture. "It's worse," Laetus interjected, his soldier's face grim. "He's been talking about executing the entire Senate on New Year's Day. He wants to march into the Senate House dressed as a gladiator and murder them all personally. He believes they're plotting against him, and soon they will be if they aren't already." The room fell silent. They were discussing the assassination of a Roman emperor, a crime that carried the most terrible punishments imaginable. If they failed, they would be tortured for days, their deaths designed to be as prolonged and agonizing as possible. Their families would be killed. Their names would be erased from history. But if they did nothing, Rome itself might die. When? Marcia finally asked. "Soon," Laetus replied. "Before the New Year spectacle. Before he can execute the Senate. We have perhaps a week, maybe less." "How?" Eclectus whispered. "He's surrounded by guards. He trusts no food we haven't tested. He varies his routine constantly. How do we reach him?" Marcia's eyes hardened. "Leave that to me. I'm the only one he still trusts completely. The only one allowed in his private chambers, without guards present. I can get close to him." They planned through the night. Every detail had to be perfect. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and they would all die. Laetus would ensure the Praetorian Guard looked the other way at the crucial moment. Eclectus would manage the palace staff, making sure no one interfered. And Marcia would do the actual deed. But Commodus was making their task harder by the day. His behavior grew more erratic as the new year approached. He spent entire days in his private arena, killing drugged animals and bound prisoners until he was drenched in blood and exhausted. He would then stagger to his chambers, where Marcia would bathe him, listening to his feverish ravings about his divine nature. "I am Hercules," he would mumble, half asleep in the bath. "The gods themselves bow before me. I have killed 1,000 men. I have strangled lions with my bare hands. I am immortal. No weapon can harm me. No poison can touch me. I am eternal." Marcia would nod and smile, washing the blood from his hair, while inside her heart screamed. December 28th arrived. The conspirators met one final time. Marcia brought poison, a powerful toxin obtained from a Greek physician, who asked no questions and was paid enough to ensure silence. The plan was simple. She would mix it into Commodus's wine after one of his exhausting arena sessions, when he was too tired to be cautious. That evening, Commodus killed 30 ostriches with specially weighted javelins, then fought 6 heavily drugged lions. He emerged victorious, as always, and returned to his chamber soaked in blood and glory. Marcia was waiting with wine, food, and a warm bath. He drank deeply, celebrating his victories, describing each kill in graphic detail. Marcia poured more wine. The poison was in the 3rd cup, mixed with a heavy, spiced wine that masked any unusual taste. Commodus drained it in a single gulp. The conspirators waited. An hour passed. Then, too, Marcia sent word to Eclectus and Laetus. It was done. The poison was working. Rome's nightmare would soon be over. But they had made a terrible miscalculation. Commodus had spent years consuming small amounts of various poisons to build immunity, a practice learned from paranoid emperors before him. His body recognized the toxin and rebelled. Instead of dying quietly, he began vomiting violently, purging the poison from his system. He was going to survive, and now he knew someone had tried to kill him. The sound of Commodus vomiting echoed through the imperial chambers like the roar of a wounded beast. Marcia stood frozen in the doorway, her face drained of all color, watching as the Emperor of Rome emptied his stomach into a golden basin. The poison, the carefully prepared, supposedly foolproof poison, was coming out in streams of wine-dark liquid. With each violent heave, her chances of survival diminished. Commodus's eyes, bloodshot and wild, found her through the haze of his sickness. For a moment, their gazes locked. In that instant, Marcia saw the terrible truth reflected in his fevered stare. He knew, maybe not the full details, not the names of all the conspirators, but he knew that someone had tried to murder him, and she had been the one to serve him the wine. Marcia, he gasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His voice was hoarse, damaged by the violence of his purging. The wine, something was wrong with the wine. She forced herself to move forward, to adopt the concerned expression of a worried lover. My lord, you've overexerted yourself. The fighting, the heat, the exertion. Your body is rejecting the wine. Let me call for physicians. No. The word cracked like a whip. Commodus pulled himself upright, swaying slightly. Even poisoned and weakened, he was physically imposing, his gladiator's body rippling with muscle. No physicians. No one enters this room. Not until I understand what's happening. Marcia's heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear her pulse in her ears, a thunderous drumbeat that surely he could hear as well. She had to get word to Eclectus and Laetus. They needed to know the plan had failed. They needed to act now, before Commodus's strength returned, before he began his investigations, before the torture chambers filled with screaming conspirators. My lord, you need rest. She tried again, moving toward him as if to help him to his bed. Let me? His hand shot out with startling speed, gripping her wrist with crushing force. His fingers dug into her flesh, and she bit back a cry of pain. You're frightened? He observed, his eyes narrowing. Why are you frightened, Marcia? What do you know? You're hurting me, she whispered, tears forming, whether from pain or terror. She couldn't say. For a long moment, Commodus studied her face. She could see his mind working, even to the fog of the poison. He was paranoid, but not stupid. He had survived years of palace intrigue by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were screaming danger. Then, abruptly, he released her. Leave me, he commanded. Send in Narcissus. I want my wrestling partner. Exercise will clear my head. Burn out whatever sickness afflicts me. Marcia fled the room, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. Once outside, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, struggling to breathe. A passing slave stared at her in concern, but she waved him away. She had to think. She had to act. Narcissus was Commodus's wrestling partner and occasional assassin, a massive wrestler from North Africa who had been brought to Rome as a slave and earned his freedom through his skill. He was strong enough to match even Commodus in physical combat, which was precisely why the emperor enjoyed grappling with him. It was one of the few activities where Commodus faced genuine challenge, though even then, Narcissus knew to let the emperor win most matches. Marcia found him in the servants' quarters, preparing for bed. One look at her face told him something was catastrophically wrong. The poison failed, she hissed, pulling him into an empty corridor. He's sick but recovering. He suspects something. He's asking for you. He wants to wrestle. Narcissus's expression darkened. He was part of the conspiracy, recruited because his access to Commodus was unique. He could get physically close to the emperor in ways no one else could, wrestling and training with him in private. But it had always been a backup plan, a last resort if the poison failed. If I goad him now and try to kill him, the guards will execute me immediately, Narcissus said slowly, even if I succeed. We're all dead anyway if we don't act tonight, Marcia replied urgently. He'll start investigating in the morning. He'll find a poison source. He'll torture the servants. Eventually, he'll learn everything. Our only chance is now, while he's weakened, while we still have the element of surprise. Narcissus nodded slowly. He was a practical man, a survivor. He understood the brutal mathematics of their situation. Tell Eclectus and Laetus to have horses ready at the western gate. If I succeed, I'll need to flee the city immediately. If you succeed, you'll be the man who saved Rome, Marcia corrected. Laetus has promised that whoever kills Commodus will be richly rewarded by the next emperor. They had already chosen a successor, Pertinax, an elderly senator and former general who was respected by both the military and the Senate. He was waiting in his villa, knowing nothing of the plot, but prepared to assume power if offered. It was better that way. If the conspiracy failed, Pertinax could claim ignorance. Narcissus made his way to Commodus's private chambers. The Praetorian guards at the door knew him well and stepped aside without question. Inside, the room was dimly lit by oil lamps. The smell of vomit still hung in the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of blood that seemed to cling to Commodus wherever he went. The emperor was stripped to his loincloth, stretching in the center of the room. The vomiting had left him weakened, his movements less fluid than usual, but he was still dangerous. His body was covered in scars from his arena fights, mostly shallow cuts from stage battles, but scars nonetheless. He saw them as marks of honor, proof of his warrior nature. Narcissus, Commodus greeted him, his voice still hoarse. Good. I need to work this sickness from my body. Let's wrestle, but truly wrestle this time. No holding back. I want to feel challenged. They began to grapple, circling each other in the traditional wrestling stance. Narcissus was acutely aware of the guards just outside the door, of the fact that Commodus wore a small knife on his belt even while wrestling, of the 1,000 ways this could go wrong. They locked up, muscle straining against muscle. Commodus was weakened by the poison, but adrenaline and fury were giving him strength. He fought with desperate intensity, as if trying to prove to himself that he was still invincible, still Hercules incarnate. Someone tried to poison me tonight, Commodus suddenly said as they grappled. I'm certain of it now. The wine was wrong. Marcia was frightened. Someone in this palace wants me dead. Narcissus said nothing, focusing on the wrestling, waiting for his opportunity. When I find them, Commodus continued, his breath hot against Narcissus's ears they struggled, I'll make their deaths last for days. I'll have them torn apart slowly. I'll feed them to animals piece by piece while they still live. I'll show Rome what happens to those who challenge a god. They broke apart, circling again. Sweat poured down both men's bodies. The oil lamps flickered, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. But you're loyal, aren't you, Narcissus? Commodus asked, a strange note in his voice. You'd never betray me. You owe me everything. Your freedom, your life, your purpose. Yes, my lord, Narcissus replied quietly. Then help me find them, Commodus demanded. Starting tomorrow, we'll root out every conspirator in this palace. We'll torture the servants, interrogate the guards, question everyone close to me. Someone will break. Someone always breaks. That was when Narcissus realized there was no escape, no possibility of mercy or reprieve. If he didn't act now, Marcia would be on the torture racks by noon tomorrow. Eclectus would be crucified in the Forum. Laetus would be torn apart by horses. And Narcissus himself would die screaming. They locked up again, and this time Narcissus didn't hold back. He drove forward with all his considerable strength, using techniques he never dared employ against the emperor before. Commodus, surprised by the sudden aggression, stumbled backward. They crashed into a table, sending golden plates and cups flying. The noise was tremendous. Commodus's eyes widened with understanding. "You," he gasped. "You're one of them." Narcissus's hands found the emperor's throat. Commodus fought like a demon, his fingers clawing at Narcissus's face, drawing blood. He tried to reach his knife, but couldn't get the angle. His legs kicked, searching for leverage. Despite the poison weakening him, despite Narcissus's superior position, Commodus was ferociously strong. They rolled across the floor, knocking over oil lamps. One shattered, sending flames licking across spilled oil. The smoke began to fill the room. Outside, the guards heard the commotion but hesitated. The emperor often made noise during his wrestling sessions. They had been ordered never to interrupt unless explicitly summoned. They waited uncertain, while inside their emperor fought for his life. Narcissus pressed harder, his massive hands constricting around Commodus's windpipe. The emperor's face turned purple, his eyes bulging. His struggles became more frantic, more desperate. He tried to speak, but no sound came out except a horrible gurgling. For 30 terrible seconds, they remained locked in that death grip. Commodus's eyes, those eyes that had watched thousands die in the arena, began to glaze over. His movements became spasmodic, uncontrolled. His fingers, which had gripped the club that killed so many, slowly relaxed. The Emperor of Rome, who believed himself a god, who thought himself invincible, was dying on the floor of his own chamber, strangled like a common criminal. His final breath rattled out. Commodus was dead. Narcissus remained frozen over the body for several heartbeats, his massive hands still wrapped around the cold throat of the man who had been Emperor of Rome. The flickering flames from the spilled oil cast dancing shadows across Commodus's face, making it seem almost alive, as if at any moment those eyes might snap open and the nightmare would begin again. But they didn't. The chest beneath Narcissus's weight was still. The pulse was gone. The god was dead. Hercules had fallen. Slowly, Narcissus released his grip and stood, his legs trembling from exertion and the enormity of what he had just done. He had killed the Emperor of Rome. He had strangled the son of Marcus Aurelius with his bare hands. History would remember this moment forever. Whether it would remember him as a hero or a villain depended entirely on what happened in the next few hours. The smoke was thickening, and he moved quickly to extinguish the flames before they spread. The last thing the conspiracy needed was for the palace to burn down and draw attention before they were ready. Once the fire was out, he moved to the door and opened it carefully. The 2 Praetorian guards outside straightened to attention. They looked at him expectantly, seeing nothing unusual about a wrestling partner emerging from the emperor's chambers. They had witnessed this scene hundreds of times. "The emperor has retired for the night," Narcissus said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "He is not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Those are his direct orders." The guards nodded and resumed their positions. Narcissus walked away with measured steps, fighting the urge to run. Every moment he expected shouts of alarm, the sound of discovery, the thunder of boots as soldiers came to arrest him. But the palace remained eerily quiet. He found Marcia in her chambers, pacing like a caged animal. Eclectus was with her, his face ashen. Both turned as Narcissus entered, their eyes wide with desperate questions. "It's done," Narcissus said simply. Marcia's legs gave out, and she sank onto a couch, her hands covering her face. Eclectus crossed himself, an unusual gesture for a Roman, but these were unusual times. For a long moment, none of them spoke. They had planned this for weeks, had steeled themselves to this moment. But now that it had arrived, the reality was overwhelming. "How?" Eclectus finally asked. "Strangled. During wrestling. It looked like an accident at first, a match that went too far. But the guards will realize the truth soon enough." Narcissus's voice was flat, emotionless. "We need to move quickly." Eclectus nodded, his administrative mind already working through the logistics. Laetus is with his most trusted Praetorians. They're prepared to secure the palace. I'll wake the household staff and inform them that the emperor has died suddenly. Natural causes. A seizure in the night. Before dawn, we need to have Pertinax here, ready to assume power. The Senate, Marcia interjected. Looking up, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. They need to ratify the succession immediately, before any of Commodus's loyalists can organize resistance. I'll send riders now, Eclectus confirmed. The senior senators are already aware that something significant might happen tonight. They'll convene at first light. Everything moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed play. Laetus arrived with a century of Praetorian guards, men he had personally selected for their loyalty to Rome rather than to Commodus. Together, they entered the emperor's chambers and discovered the body. The official story was prepared. The emperor had suffered a violent seizure while exercising. His excessive lifestyle, the strain of his constant arena performances, had finally overtaken his heart. It was tragic, unexpected, but not entirely surprising given his behavior. The guards who had been stationed outside Commodus's door were quietly reassigned to distant postings before they could speak too freely about what they might have heard. The servants who had been on duty were generously paid and given stern warnings about spreading rumors. Money and fear worked equally well to buy silence. As the first gray light of dawn touched the Roman sky, messengers were already racing through the city, waking senators and officials with the stunning news. Emperor Commodus was dead. The nightmare was over. In his villa on the Esquiline Hill, Publius Helvius Pertinax was roused from sleep by urgent knocking. The elderly senator, he was 66 years old, ancient by Roman standards, had been a distinguished general and administrator under Marcus Aurelius. He was everything Commodus was not. Moderate, experienced, respected by both the military and the Senate. When Laetus and a delegation of Praetorian guards arrived at his door and informed him that Commodus was dead and Rome needed him, Pertinax's first reaction was fear. "This is a trap," he said immediately. "Commodus has done this before, pretended to be dead to expose conspirators. I won't fall for it." "My lord," Laetus replied solemnly, "I have just come from the palace. I have seen the body with my own eyes. Emperor Commodus is truly dead. Rome needs a leader, and the Praetorians have chosen you." It took nearly an hour to convince Pertinax that this was an elaborate execution plot. Finally, still half convinced he was walking to his death, the old senator agreed to accompany them to the palace. As his litter passed through the streets in the pre-dawn darkness, Romans were already beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by rumors that something momentous had occurred. By the time Pertinax reached the Senate House, word had spread throughout the city. The reaction was not what the conspirators had feared. There were no riots, no mobs demanding vengeance for their emperor. Instead, there was celebration. People danced in the streets. Wine flowed freely from fountains. Statues of Commodus that had been erected throughout the city were torn down by jubilant crowds and dragged through the mud. His images were defaced, his inscriptions chiseled away. The Senate, convening in an emergency session, moved with unprecedented speed to condemn his memory. Damnatio memoriae, the erasure from history. Let his name be struck from every monument, one senator declared, his voice shaking with emotion. Let his statues be melted down. Let his titles be revoked. He was not an emperor. He was a curse upon Rome. The motion passed unanimously. Not a single senator spoke in Commodus's defense. The 12-year nightmare of his reign was being systematically erased as if it had never happened. Pertinax was declared emperor by acclamation. In his first address to the Senate, he promised to restore the dignity and governance that Rome had lost. He would rule as Marcus Aurelius had ruled, with wisdom, justice, and respect for Roman traditions. The senators wept with relief. But in the palace, as servants cleaned the chamber where Commodus had died, they found something that sent chills through everyone who saw it. Clutched in the dead emperor's hand was a scrap of parchment, one of his execution lists. The names on it included Marcia, Eclectus, and Laetus. He had known, perhaps not all the details, but he had known that the people closest to him were plotting his death. The paranoia that consumed him hadn't been entirely madness after all. It had been justified. But that same paranoia had created the very conspiracy it feared, had driven loyal servants to murder, had transformed offenders into assassins. Narcissus, true to Laodicus' promise, was paid handsomely for his role in saving Rome. But he couldn't spend the money. 3 days after Commodus' death, Narcissus was found dead in his quarters, poisoned. The official story was suicide, overcome with guilt for his role in the emperor's death. But those close to the conspiracy knew better. Dead men tell no tales, and Narcissus knew too much. Marcia survived, but her life was never the same. She retired from public life, using her considerable wealth to support Christian communities. She never spoke publicly about that night, about the poison that failed, about the desperate hours when Rome's fate hung by a thread. She died 5 years later. Some said of natural causes. Others whispered of a broken heart. Eclectus continued serving as chamberlain under Pertinax, bringing his organizational skills to the new administration. He helped dismantle the network of spies and informers that Commodus had created, try to restore some normalcy to the palace. But he too would not live long. When Pertinax was himself assassinated after only 3 months as emperor, Eclectus died defending him. Laodicus, the Praetorian prefect who had orchestrated so much, survived the longest. He helped install the next emperor, then the next. The Praetorians had learned that they could make and unmake emperors, a lesson that would haunt Rome for generations. Laodicus eventually fell victim to the same game he had played, executed by an emperor who feared his power. As for Commodus himself, his body was initially treated with the respect due an emperor. But once the Senate's condemnation was official, even that dignity was stripped away. He was buried in an unmarked grave, his name forbidden to be spoken. The Colosseum, which he had renamed after himself, was restored to its original name. The months he had renamed were changed back. Every trace of his reign was systematically erased, except for the memories. The people of Rome would never forget the emperor who thought he was Hercules, who killed thousands in the arena, who transformed the empire into his personal torture chamber. Parents would frighten misbehaving children with tales of mad Commodus. Historians would write about him as a cautionary tale of absolute power corrupting absolutely. The chamber where he died was sealed and never used again. Servants refused to enter it, claiming they could hear sounds in the night. The grunts of wrestling, the gurgling of strangulation, the death rattle of God who discovered he was mortal after all. In the end, Commodus's attempt to become immortal like Hercules had succeeded in a way he never intended. He would indeed be remembered forever, not as a hero, not as a god, but as a monster. His name would echo through history as one of Rome's worst emperors, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and madness. The Gladiator emperor had fought his final match, and unlike the thousands of rigged contests in the arena, this time he had lost. His death marked the end of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, the end of the 5 good emperors era that his father Marcus Aurelius had concluded. After Commodus, Rome would ascend into chaos. The year of the 5 emperors, civil wars, and instability that would eventually lead to the empire's decline. But on that December night in 192 AD, as Narcissus's hands tightened around the imperial throat, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that the nightmare was ending. The god was dying, and Rome, bloodied and traumatized, would survive to see another dawn. The final lesson of Commodus was written not in the arena sand, but in the desperate struggle on his chamber floor. Even gods can bleed. Even Hercules can fall. And power, no matter how absolute, is always mortal.